I'm tempted to say follow that, but thank you very much. Thank you for coming back. At least we have an audience for the next half, and we have 2 more speakers, and then we have a panel discussion involving everybody. And it gives me great pleasure to invite our next speaker, who's Dr. Anne Alex, who is the Regulatory Affairs and Risk Management Leader for Europe, Middle East and Africa with Dow DuPont. And she's based in the UK. I believe she visits it very occasionally, but she's normally well away and zooming around the world. The talk is entitled Ecosystem Service-Based Environmental Risk Assessment for Regulated Stressors, a Stakeholder's Perspective. Please, Anne, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Tony. So, good morning, everyone. I'd like my predecessors to thank EFSA for giving me this opportunity to share the work on ecosystem services we've done with you today, and I hope it will bring a little drop of hope in the fact that we are going to sort that out, I'm sure, in the next few years, how we handled with ecosystem services in risk assessment. So this is a talk I have prepared together with Professor Lauren Maltby from the University of Sheffield for the reason that she's been a quite precious advisor on the work we've been doing on those active substances in the past, and it was really good to have her input to be able to get it right and to get additional perspective. And I will also introduce part of a project she leads at the end of this presentation. Can you hear me well, first of all? Cool, thank you. So the outline of this presentation is from industry perspective, why consider ecosystem services in a risk assessment for pesticide in agriculture, and you will see we don't have necessarily different opinion to most of you. Also, I'll get a bit practical. We've started to work on that with data through 2 case studies, and I'll certainly go through one before you wave at me for the end of my time. Otherwise, I'll accelerate, and I'll also give you a little bit of thought on the challenges and how can they be addressed in the future. So, why consider those ecosystem services in risk assessment for regulated products? So just as a sort of a reminder for those of you who might not be familiar with regulations on pesticides and what it involves and implies in terms of data requirement. So we've got quite a lot of data requirements to put in dossiers when we submit those pesticides for a peer review and evaluation, coordinated here and led by EFSA. The purpose is to evaluate a long list of risks to evaluate the risks that the use of a product can pose to groundwater quality, surface water quality, aquatic organisms, terrestrial organisms, in the fields, but also outside the fields, because fields are connected to areas and transfers may happen, so you do need to know what is happening, follow your pesticide degradation products, and also evaluate the risks properly. And we've got regulatory protection goals to match, and we need to make sure before a decision is made that these products do not impact non-target species, including the ongoing behavior of those species. So this is regulation wording, and impacts on biodiversity and the ecosystem. So this is a link here to the purpose of looking at ecosystems, not only their structure and function, but also the services they do deliver in the context of crop production and crop protection. So if we take a very now practical example of what it means evaluating risk for example, soil macro-organisms. So I will be talking about this nematicide product that is applied to soil at pre-planting for vegetable crops, etc. In the case you've got nematodes to control that could impair your crop growth and significantly reduce yields. So this is data that have been extracted from basically an EFSA journal. So this is the way we do the risk assessment. So you've got data that you've generated in the context of your dossier, laboratory studies on an earthworm species, but also on Columbola. And you can see from your toxicity to exposure ratio, which is what you do when you do a conventional risk assessment, that you've got here a toxicity exposure ratio that is above the regulatory trigger value for earthworm, so you're happy. But it might not be the case for other species, and in particular for the Columbola, we have got a bit of a distance to the regulatory trigger value. So when you see that sort of data, as a risk assessor, but also later on as a risk manager, if you don't have any other data, what does that mean? It means that according to guidance document, well, there is a possible risk. You need a risk assessment refinement if you want to go further, and if you've got any data that you think may be relevant to help refine the risk assessment. So you need risk assessment refinement to represent what is going to happen more realistically in the conditions of use of your product. So you may decide to generate higher tier data and field data. So we've done field data. We've went out and started to do some field studies, not in tomato production, and this is where we start talking extrapolation, not because we didn't want to, but because they're not necessarily the soil that are the richest in macrofauna. So if you want to have a chance to see an effect, you're going to select crops where you've got a more abundant population, so that you've got a chance to detect smaller effects, if any. So we did a few studies, and well, in 2 of the studies, no statistical difference to the control, so you're happy. In the 3rd study, development of columbolan were slightly delayed after treatment. There was a full recovery, but still, you've seen an effect. So what does that mean in terms of conclusion of a risk assessment? So, and this is a question we have as risk assessors, you have as risk assessors, everybody's got. What does that mean for columbolan population? You know you're not in your tomato crop. So can I just use the result as for tomato crops, or is that different? What's the likelihood of these effects to occur? Perhaps yes, perhaps not. We don't know. It's an endpoint in time, so it's usually selected to be worst case, but we don't know. Can this be mitigated? Is there any reduction dose, application interval, whatever, that we could think about to mitigate those risks? Can we just treat the crop? Do we really need this product to be applied after all? So these are all legitimate questions that even we have when we see those effects happening. So, and what would be the consequences? So I don't apply my product to control nematode. There will be consequences. What are they? So let's pose the equation into this way. So what are we trying to achieve in the crop? We're trying to produce tomato. And also we are trying to protect the environment and biodiversity, etc. But we're trying to do all those things at the same time. So if you look here at the 2 first bars here, if you do not treat your tomatoes at all, you don't try to control nematodes, and when you've got nematode infestation that need a treatment, you can get significant yield reduction. So we've discussed about the yield this morning, and I will put that in perspective. So you can get up to 23% yield reduction. What does that mean? Is that acceptable for a farmer? Is that acceptable for all farmers? I don't have the answer. I'm not asking you to answer there. But these are all the questions that come to you. So we've got here an equation that could be 23% reduction in yields versus slight effects on columbola. What do we do? And this is a question we've got as well as industry, so we share the pain. Okay, so what do we do? Vote. I'm not going to go for a vote now, we don't have the time in the timing. Or can we get a better informed decision? Can we dig into what we're trying to do, dig into the services? I'm not saying we're going to inundate you with data so that you're going to accept my transient effect. I'm not going there. But can we get any insight from the ecosystem services perspective to make a better informed decision making, to look really at the services that occur in those tomato crop production, and see where we are with the soil organisms, with the tomato, how they look like, and with the other services that are provided in those crops. So we did it. We went to visit farms, and in Italy, in 2 regions, in Puglia and in Sicily, we aligned a number of farms, and we went to see the farmers with an ecologist, a toxicologist. We had all our representative sort of protection goals here, and we also had economists, sociologists coming with us to look at, to discuss with the farmer, to look at the farms, to look at the ecosystems, at those landscape, and try to understand, try to look the ecosystem services in the eyes and have probably a better vision, at least, try to get to see what we were talking about. So we went in those areas. So the idea, we developed a complex system of questionnaire with crossed question to understand what's the practice there, how the products are used, touch on all the possibly the treatments as well that are brought to the tomatoes, are the farmers only growing tomatoes, etc. So try to understand the practices and their potential flexibility. How nervous is a farmer to do it this way, or is he capable of a slightly move an application period or some sort of practice. Understand the variability of, so look at the environmental descriptors, so where are the groundwater, the surface water, what birds do we see, what are they, etc. Understand the variability, so we visited diverse farms of diverse size. Understand the importance of the crop in space and time. Do we need to grow those tomatoes everywhere, or can we not avoid the vulnerable area, for example, to try to address that question, at least partly. The sociological importance, so we've really tried, we've looked at all the key papers and we thought, okay, let's go try to do it. And we, where possible, did cross-verification of the data with available national database, like and particularly the data regarding to crop protection, what type of tomato, for what type of market, etc., so that we understood really what was behind the data, but also some environmental data as well. So just a few pictures to show you what it looked like. So we took quite a lot of pictures because we really wanted to understand the diversity in the different groups of organisms, for example. So we did sampling, observations, etc., to try to figure that out. And we had long discussions about the services that we thought we should retain in the study. So these are probably looking very familiar to you. Because we've been seeing them earlier with the previous talk, so I'm not going to list them again. But we've been quite broad into the services that we retained because they were kind of all there in the surveys, but also in the data we've seen. So, for example, for the habitat services, it was very important for us to look really that into the detail, to be able to better interpret our data. We looked at habitat services, and also we looked at the non-target species here in terms of indicators. So the way we did that is that from the data we collected in the farms, we've characterized more precisely the exposure. So we've used exactly the same way to calculate exposure, but we've adapted it to the situation where you grow tomato. So it's just slight adaptations in the calculation to better reflect what is happening. We've done some modeling using 2 years as the usual rotation between crops, if any. We've used the endpoints. Alors, I'm back to Valérie's talk this morning. We haven't changed the endpoints at all. We've used the endpoints that we use in the dossier because that's the data we have. So they are proxies, but so we've done this to calculate the exposure to toxicity indices and the risk indices that are displayed here that confirm that really we're talking in terms of vulnerability, soil organisms really come out as the species, the group that you need to look at. So it's confirmed by the field approach and the habitat as well. We looked at different scenarios, nematicide control, non-nematicide control, and sort of a physical protection against nematodes, which consists of solarization, where you could lose some habitat because you isolate basically your soil out of the environment. But what is important to look at here, so the soil was really confirmed as an important parameter, and versus pollination, for example, that there was no risk for the bumblebees being used in tomato pollination, etc. So it confirmed that we were really looking at the right parameters. So when you look at the combination of this risk index versus tomato production, so you've got indeed, we are back to, there is an effect, it's visible, it is transient, but then it disappears, and you've got your production as planned. So these studies confirmed that the effects on soil organisms were expected to be limited in amplitude, but also in the abundance of the columbola that were observed in this field. If you look at more services here, so we looked, as I said, to pollination, we looked at food provision, so this is the scenario where you treat against nematodes, the scenario where you don't treat against nematodes. You can see that the food provision is definitely the most impacted, but also soil erosion, and this is something we didn't suspect, because if you lose yields, you lose soil coverage, and then your soil becomes more vulnerable to erosion. This is something that it's a service, and that we do not necessarily take into account in the when you look at effects on non-target organisms. It's actually looking at the crop itself that is showing you this. So, and we thought, well, how do we deal with that? So, the effects on the habitat services here were not impacted by the fact you use or not a product. They were inferior to the effects on other services, like, for example, food provision and soil erosion prevention. And so, and I warned you, I'm not going to say, so therefore you can accept an effect of columbola. No, this is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it is worth trying to mitigate it as much as possible in order to reduce the effect on columbola here to 0 and get as high as you can here with your tomato production. So the importance here is to say, okay, this is without management. Now, can we work with the farmer? Can we work as a company to adapt our conditions of use so that we keep a good production here in completely meeting the protection goal with no negotiation on any of the risk assessment parameters? And so we've been working since. There is another publication on that, on the risk mitigation that you can develop to further, and how we can adapt the conditions of use of product to reach that goal that takes into account more parameters. So these field visits really provided visuals of what we're trying to do. So we learned a lot. This is what it looks like. And it identifies indicators on how they rank compared to each other in terms of exposure and vulnerability. So as well, you can better understand when you make your decision where you are with all those indicators. And it also, as I said, informed us on ecosystem services that are not yet taken into account in the risk assessment. And we didn't look at them because they're not necessarily the fact of only non-target species. They can also involve the crop. So a crop is more than a yield. It is also for what it provides in terms of habitat and in terms of other services like protection from erosion and etc. So for us, it was a learning. We're still brewing on it, how you do that, but it was quite interesting. So case study 2, I will just fly through because I'm probably already talking too much and too long. So it was same approach, an insecticide to control the Californian red scale, data-rich compound. And we looked as well at different parameters. So it's got a potential risk to birds that needs definitely to be looked at, but also pollinators and non-target arthropods. So we did as well loads of field visits in order to understand what it looks like and the practice and the habitat and describe all those services into those fields. So we had different options. XSL is used, no treatment is used, risk mitigation measures are implemented, and simply the farmer doesn't have access to what he thinks is a sustainable treatment. He will therefore abandon the citrus orchard to do something else. It's not a majority, but this is a scenario that might happen. And so this is the approach we followed. You're probably very familiar with it if you've been involved into ecosystem services. The ecosystem we retained were the habitat, the yields or income, which are more or less, they are very linked, so they were the same thing. The landscape, but also a factor that appeared quite important in this study was the carbon sequestration. It's been evoked this morning. It's probably one of the main learning of this ecosystem services study is that the simple fact to grow those orchards was implying two things: water management, you need to irrigate these, and that creates a habitat. So when you, as a scientist, you turn them in that field, you see this habitat that also results from the management of the crop, and that brings a much richer habitat than if you wouldn't irrigate the crop. So the crop management itself is connected to habitat, but also carbon sequestration, because it's much more efficient in trees than in any sort of replacement set aside bushes that would be there. So another learning regarding looking at the big picture. And again, you're not going to compromise your birds for this. What you're going to do is decide if it is worth mitigating risk and work at a very solid and revised way to use your product to keep the production going while preserving much better those services. And this is the learning here of this study. So the challenges in ecosystem services that I wanted to touch very briefly, looking at my chairs here, have been described in this paper from Lorraine that is really the founding part of the next steps on the work we will be doing. They're listed here. You know them: anthropocentrism, valuation, complexity, unfamiliar language, etc. So some of them, I think we've been touching on them a little bit during this presentation. Here we've been working with data-rich studies. When you're talking about tools and how to interpret that, how do you do that on a routine base with a normal dossier where you don't have like 23 field studies on an insecticide? So this is something we need to sort out, and I really much appreciate the input from Valérie about modeling and how we can help put some things into equation. How do the current studies relate to ecosystem services? So how close are we with current studies? I think we need at some point to get out, and I very much appreciated as well the comment that was made by Martin Dermine, I think this morning, about monitoring. Going out in the field and look at what your services look like can really bring a plus into the way we can help interpret and connect them to some to our usual species and risk indicators. This is also from Lorraine's paper. It is a mapping of the standard ecosystem test guidelines against the services and how well they are represented. So there is in the presentation the reference to this paper. So I really invite you to take a look. So as you can see, there are loads of blanks still, which we will need to fill through modeling, through perhaps revisiting some of the parameters, particularly of higher tier studies. How can we better extract data from a pollinator field study into pollination? There must be a solution. I can't believe there isn't. We just need to look at it on a more probably functional way. And so we probably are at the verge of looking into those data-rich dossiers to see how, if we had them, if we look at them, what can they teach you in terms of those services. For the valuation, I won't go into the details. The value is context dependent. We could discuss the price of tomatoes nearly at the farm level. So obviously, if you keep the comparison with your columbola, the columbola's got a different value, and I really appreciated the talk of Wayne this morning. How can we get agreement? It's much easier at a smaller scale because the value is probably more homogeneous than if you want to accept the value of tomato or columbola at the national level. So we will need to decline those studies at a more local level. And we need to agree on the significance of a change in value. 23% yield doesn't mean the same thing in a small producer and in a great producer, a larger producer, so it's pointless. But it's what it means in terms of services that we can probably all agree on in terms of other services. So just to introduce briefly the CARES project, this is a proof of concept study that will be a follow-up of all this, where we will be looking at different regulated products, approaches, and compare the outcome of ecosystem risk-based risk assessment with the outcome of current regulatory risk assessment approaches, to try to provide a bit of light and our little contribution to the debate. So conclusion, in ecosystem services, we definitely believe they can provide added value to the assessment of all those regulated chemicals and a bit of more insight into the decision making. And hopefully the case studies will help bring a bit of light onto all this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm sorry there's been so much information in the case studies that we've really compressed the question time. I can probably take one from the audience if anybody has a question they'd like to ask. Please, could you give your name and your association?
Yes,
thank you.
Gabor Løvej from Aarhus University in Denmark. Two points I'd like to raise, which is very interesting. And one of them is a conflation between ecological structure and ecological function. In your presentation, you several times mentioned an outcome of a process like soil erosion, but what actually was monitored is number of collembola. Now there is a link very frequently made because we can monitor things very easily, count things very easily, but very frequently we are interested in the outcome of an ecological process. So I think there is some task there to clarify this relationship.
Was it a question?
No. This one? Okay, now it's on. The second is that it's very interesting to see, and it's a good advance, that now several aspects are considered simultaneously. But at the moment, all of them have the same weight. When I saw this picture, lizards and birds and collembola are considered. And I think we have more ecology and we can start thinking of putting various weights on these different elements. So I really salute the complexity of this assessment. It's very, very encouraging. But I think these could be possible avenues to make it even more realistic ecologically. Thank you.
Totally agree. And we're very happy to be the straw man here. So definitely, and I think it's really worth looking into more depth to perhaps, we've done it the way we thought was a start, but totally agree there are adjustments that would be needed on the basis of those data sets now.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. The last of our 5 speakers this morning is Professor Marie Stentecker, who is a social scientist, and she's Professor in Human Geography at the Department for Economy and Society, the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. At present, she's also co-chair of the multidisciplinary expert panel of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And the title of Marie's talk is Valuing Nature's Contributions to People, the Approach of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. All yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the organizer for inviting me, and also congratulate the organizer to putting together such a diverse team of speakers. We talk about the same things but in different languages. So now you will be hearing social science language on ecosystem services, and from the perspective of a global platform. I have the honor to be the co-chair of the multidisciplinary expert panel, the interdisciplinary panel that we have that leads the work of IPBES. IPBES is a fairly new platform. We still strive to be as famous as IPCC, but I'm not sure that every one of you have heard of IPBES, so I will start my presentation by giving you an idea of what IPBES is. And then I will talk about the conceptual evolution we have been doing concerning values, and also introducing the new term nature contributions to people and why we've done so. And then I've tried to think about some implication for environmental risk management connected to food. Now I'm on a slippery area because it's not really my area. Anyway, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Platform on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, was founded in 2012 with the overall goal then to provide policy-relevant knowledge on biodiversity ecosystem services to decision making. It's run under the auspices of UN, like the IPCC, the climate panel. Currently we have 130 governments connected to us, and a number of others are observers. We relate to 4 UN bodies, and we are administered by UN Environment. We are at current implementing the first work program. We'll show that later. And the main task we are heading for are working with assessments. Now, it's not the only thing. We're also trying to improve the capacities in various countries, especially the Global South. And we are run mainly by a secretariat hosted in Bonn. IPBES relates first and foremost to the Convention on Biodiversity, but we also acknowledge and work together with a number of other global conventions. We also, of course, acknowledge the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's tasked to IPBES not just to look at goal number 14 and 15, but doing this also in consideration of all the other 15 goals. So that has to be kept in mind, and that's why I'm standing here as a human geographer, that is not a biologist, that we need to take into account how to provide also for food, equity, good health, and so on. IPBES assessment is the main part we're doing, and we have been engaging about 1,300 experts from all over the world in working with providing a number of assessments similar to the work done by IPCC, but not exactly the same way. We are not working exactly the same way. We have released in 2016 2 assessments on one on pollination, which has a kind of very good uptake and is of much relevance for the themes on this conference. And there's also a technical assessment on scenarios and modeling that was presented in 2016. Earlier this year, 4 regional assessments and assessment of land degradation was approved by our plenary. And this is the one for Europe and Central Asia. These assessments are all found on the web, so you can find both the summary for policymakers and the technical reports. In next year, we will come our flagship, the global assessment, which is considered to be the follower of the next generation of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And that will be presented and hopefully approved in late April in Paris next year at our plenary. And there were just started 2 new assessments, and just come from the one on sustainable use of wild species, the first management committee meeting. But we also have started the one on diverse ways of valuing, which is of certain relevance what we discuss right here. So what I'm saying on values is, you can see it as work in progress, but the foundation we laid for how to think about values. And next year, they will also start an assessment on invasive species. I can say more about IPBES, but time isn't here. I have some brochure for those of you who are interested, so you can read more of it or look at the website. Now, I'm going to give you a background before I come to values, but it's very values related, how we frame it. And IPES strives to be inclusive when it comes to various ways of understanding the human-nature relation, and that is important to have it taken account when you think about values. So in specific, we've been working to include indigenous and local knowledge to be inclusive in that sense, and see how that contributes to, and the knowledge from that can contribute to this kind of global science policy assessment. And it shows also in the conceptual framework, and I don't ask you to understand all this, but the main points here, just to point at the idea is that this box, which is called nature, through nature contributions to people, which I will come back to, provides or good conditions for a good quality of life. In black are the kind of the concepts that we use as key concepts in IPES. In green are what could be called as Western science or ordinary science. And in blue are concepts that have been acknowledged by or put there to acknowledge the indigenous or holistic views on what is nature, human-nature relations. So you see, this is in nature contributions to people, ecosystem goods and services is included. I will come back to that later as well. But this is a way to show that we try to be inclusive to various ways of understanding human-nature relations. We also want to recognize there are various ways of valuing. And this is kind of strange in the knowledge foundation for how we should work with conservation and sustainable use, and to think about long-term human well-being, to understand that people see the world differently and that they have various ways of valuing, depending on our perspectives, depending on the context we work in, depending on culture. So in IPES, we have had a task force before working on values, and there's a preliminary guide for values that also has been presented in an article by Unite Pasquale and others that launches this idea about value pluralism. If you look here in the gray, well, there's often an economic valuation dominance in how we think about issues. The idea in IPES is not just to take the economic way of valuing, but also look at the ecological way of valuing, the social way of valuing, and the cultural and indigenous people way of valuing, and have this diverse valuation that accept diverse worldviews, and try to develop and aim at develop an integrated valuation, take into account the various ways of valuing, and also to develop forms for how to integrate and how to bridge between these various perspectives, these various ways of valuing, dependent on various worldviews. And then, of course, how to feed this into policies. In doing so, relational values have come to be one of our key concepts. And I just mentioned this because we think of intrinsic values kind of nature has values on its own. That could be debated, but some claim that, and one could think of some issues in nature, or nature as a value of its own, independent of people. Then there's a number of instrumental values that we might be able to measure in a kind of objective way. And I think many of, well, the speakers before me have been into those issues a lot in the quantitative way of kind of how do we model this. IPES also works with, well, those two of course, but also with the relational values that reflects the cultural identity, social cohesion, social responsibility, and moral responsibility. And it is both collective, could be collective in various groups, but it also individual values that relates to who I am as a person, my own identity, my activities, my background, and so on. And in that way, it cannot easily be aggregated, and it needs to be studied in other ways. And looking at ways of studying these kind of relational values, which I think is very important if we are to engage with the stakeholders that have been said by the previous speakers, and to engage also not just informing, but building this conversation with stakeholders on their views and trying to capture their perspectives and their life worlds and situations. We need to work with non-quantitative methods, and these are kind of very well established in social science and humanities: ethnography, ethno-ecological methods, participatory methods in, for example, GIS, work with narratives, interviews, qualitative and quantitative ways of ranking, participant or observation, which comes as another kind of data and the figures, but still, if we are to engage with society, which is one of the themes for tomorrow, I understand these are important scientific perspectives and knowledge and insights to bring in and merge with the more quantitative way we've been working dominantly this far with ecosystem services. IPBES builds on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and on the TEEB report, which I guess is familiar to a number of you, where the ecosystem service concept has been launched. Now, there has been some critique towards ecosystem services from indigenous people, from developing countries that feel that this is kind of a Western way of quantifying and sectorizing and making a very square way of looking at nature, but also from social science and humanities, and especially that concerns the cultural ecosystem services, which I would say is the least developed group of services, and the use of the word culture itself. So relating to this, the critique that in the global, from some countries, a number of countries in the global south, and also these from social science humanities, which have been quite extensive, and they have never been really included or never felt included in the ecosystem service research community. IPBES has done an evolution that means that we now have this nature contributions to people as an overarching concept. I just want to say something about this evolution, since many of you might be familiar to the Millennium Ecosystem Service assessments, 4 categories. Before IPBES started, the supporting ones was kind of commonly acknowledged as more a part of the foundational settings or a part of the regulating services. So we kind of started with 3. And the end result, nothing looked into all the boxes in our development of how should we treat and be respectful to the various worldviews, is to say that we use the overarching concept, NCP, nature contributions to people. It includes an ecosystem service-like way of looking at things, but we have slightly changed the overarching categories, and it's kind of a generalizing perspective. But it also includes a context-specific perspective. And importantly, it recognizes cultural contexts, infuses, that's the lens we see all the contributions. So it's very awkward to call just one box cultural services. We all see and value the services related to our cultural context. So the context-specific perspective is a holistic one, where we kind of do not differ into certain boxes, what is what not even what is human and what is nature. And this is typical for indigenous perspectives, but not only. There is a stream in social science humanities talking about more than human ways of looking at human-nature relations. The bottom here is more similar. Black, what happened? Is the resemblance of the ecosystem service perspective. I will take that in the next picture. In IPBES, we have chosen to work with 18 ones. That's the first speaker talked about 18 different NCPs, contributions to people. It's not to say that these are the 18 ones forever, but in the context of IPBES, these have been fruitful. What is important, more important to notice is that IPBES have things that there is overlap between a number of services, so it's not squarely fit into each of these three overarching ones. When the material kind of resembles the provisioning, the regulating is quite much the same as the regulating, but the non-material, the former cultural ones, maybe there's the biggest changes. And importantly, the square is, the overlaps is very specific for food, which is the theme of this conference. Food is not just something we have to survive as a biological species. It's certainly so much culture, so much identity, so much social cohesion into it. So if we just treat it as nutrition, we miss a lot of the point of food. Just to underline a couple of things in this, I mean, there's much more to be said. I'll try to be brief, and you can come back in when there's the panel. So IPBES broadens the tent in this. We don't say that ecosystem services is out. NCP, nature contributions to people, is not instead of ecosystem services. But it's a broader concept that acknowledges and tries to include other ways of value, other ways of seeing human-nature relations, and try to find, and we find a way where we discussed it in one context. The role of culture has been elevated, so it's I mean, the inclusion of more social science humanities has meant that the concept of culture and understanding of culture has been qualified, and that is also the reason why it has been elevated, and saying that the culture context influences the perception of all the contributions to people. Because we value differently, the framework includes positive as well as negative nature contributions to people. Well, the framework allows us to also have negative, because if people value differently, as a consequence, some might see negative effects of what others can see as positive ones. And from the IPBES perspective, we are not dealing with the cascade ways of thinking of ecosystem service. It's not that we say that it's wrong, but it's just we look at the beneficiaries, the demand side. How do people perceive what they get from nature? And then on the kind of the biodiversity and ecosystem functions themselves. So, my last slide, and here's, I try to interpret what might be interesting for the audience. What IPBES brings about, this is not just the change of a word or not. I think that is less of important. It is the notion, what is nature given to humans, or even if we think nature, humans part of nature. So contributions or services or benefits for whom is very important to ask, since we see things and value differently. Looking in a global perspective, it's very important to recognize that food availability is not the same as food accessibility. We cannot just count how much food can be produced. We must also look at who gets the whole of it, who can access it, who can afford it. Are the marginalized groups that never gets the food, even though poor countries can produce a lot of it. Food is more than nutrition. As I said, it's also so much cultural identity, social cohesion. People value differently. We need to acknowledge that and find ways to map that. As a consequence, and I said before, qualitative studies are needed to capture the social cultural aspects and people's various ways, varying perceptions, and various ways of valuing, and to acknowledge this and also see the kind of right-based approaches we need to have in this one. Also on a global scale, I mean, what we do here might impact far away. And as IPBES is working on to force for bridges between various ways of valuing needs to be more developed. So modeling is great. I might not say it's the only way, but we need also to see how can we how can we bridge between very quantitative way of thinking, which is much needed in some cases, with the qualitative results and those things that we can't really measure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk and also for bringing in this very important perspective from social science humanities. And I think we will have many questions from the audience. I'm happy to take them. Mm-hmm. You're not so familiar? Yes, please. There is one.
Hello, good afternoon, or morning, still morning, right? Catherine Gansleben from the European Environment Agency. Thanks for your talk. I think it was really interesting to try and capture some of these softer dimensions. But I guess my question, listening to your talk, is how do we then translate some of those into protection goals that can then feed into environmental risk assessment?
Yeah, so as I said, risk assessment is not my field. And we work as, well, this is a global environmental initiative, which works on global and regional, which is more continental levels. So this model is derived to handle this variation we have on the globe. Then I would say it's a further discussion that we now starting and are evolving on. How could this be implemented on a local or national scale? We have in all our assessments, there's a chapter on policy measure or policy solutions, and they of course differ between. But the HE targets, which some of you are familiar to, the first thing, raising awareness and engaging not just policymakers but also the broader public is crucially important, and there are various ways that has been done and how that could be improved. And then set up a set of policy tools and then implement. I mean, that's a kind of the political science first lesson. And if you read our reports, you can see where we have assessed various ways of carrying out policies. I don't think we come up with so much very new things, but for example, mainstreaming, which has been said before, seems to be crucially important to have this thinking of biodiversity into also agriculture, forestry. I think this raising awareness issue speaks very much to what I've now been saying about values. And maybe I should add that though this sounds very much social science, the majority of IPBES work is done by biologists. So there's a little tough group of us that develops and integrates and hope that there will be well, we will keep improving the integration. I mean, IPBES is for the broad scientific and broad for many worldviews. So I just maybe, if you hear people working in IPBES, they most likely are biologists. But these are the foundations that we bring into how to frame it all.
Thank you. I think we have a question via the app. Can I see it on the screen? Perfect. So the question is, with whom does EPBAS have a dialogue on protection goals in EU agriculture and on the products, pesticides or GMO, that EFSA needs to assess?
So IPBES is meant to be policy relevant, not policy prescriptive. So we are not pushing for individual countries or EU how to do things. But IPBES is a special member of otherwise it's only governments. Yes, it's a special observation status from EU has a special observation status in IPBES. So there is a delegation every time from EU following our work and also very actively commenting on the extensive review process that we have, like the IPCC. I think that is the DG Environment should be, of course. As I've heard from them, it's not so easy to cross the various DG borders. So I guess I would be happy to have a better dialogue also with DG Agriculture. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much again. Thank you. So it was our last talk for this morning. We have now a moderated panel discussion, and I would like to hand over to Tony, that is the moderator of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me just say a few words, and then I'll invite our speakers to join me on the stage. Biodiversity and ecosystem sustainability and environmental resilience in the face of challenge by regulated stressors have in common that they can't really be measured, or they can't be really measured directly. And that's the dilemma. And that's the context of what this session has all been about. And therefore, the environmental protection legislation demands no adverse impact. But that's really too vague and too imprecise to provide the operational protection goals to target our environmental risk assessment against. Now, this morning's talks have very eloquently discussed examples using ecosystem services as the means to try to identify some measurable endpoints for impact risk assessment and to link those through up an increasingly complex system. Now, EFSA is a regulatory authority, and it's a risk assessment and risk communication authority. And in EFSA context, regulated stressors are pesticides, the plant protection products, genetically modified plants, GMOs, and if you forgive the judgmental label, which was identified yesterday afternoon, alien species. In other words, those species which are regulated not to be present in the EU. And in addition to that, the deliberate release of food additives into feed additives into the environment. Now, I'd like to invite the 5 presenters this morning to come up onto the platform, and then we'll try and explore some of those questions, but I would like to try and direct it back towards what EFSA's about and what EFSA's trying to do in that wider context. Please come and join me. Wherever you like, wherever you're comfortable. And I hope that we have some microphones here. Otherwise, it will all be done by sign language. Could we have some microphones on the stage? You've had 5 contributions. I will very briefly say Dr. Anne Alex, Professor Liebe Broussard, Professor Valerie Forbes, Dr. Wayne Munz, and Professor Marie Stenzecker. Now, having listened to all those different perspectives, and you're all coming from different directions, quite rightly in this, in your view, and based on your own experiences in the field, what is needed to make the ecosystem service approach operational and fit for purpose in the context of pre-market, the so-called prospective assessment of regulated products? And obviously, there is a difference, a progressive difference from local impact up to landscape, and the complexity of how we do that increases. So, what challenges are associated with the implementation of this approach? What should be overcome? both from an ecological and perhaps a societal point of view? So there's a very easy question. Who'd like to start it? We've got 45 minutes to enjoy this discussion, and I've got a nice list of questions. So let's dive into this one. Who'd like to start? Please, Lieve. Yes, please, if you like.
Yeah, I think this question is central to the whole discussion. What I've tried to convey in my talk is that the relationship between species, ecological processes, and ecosystem services is tractable, but not straightforward. And I would like to link that to the remarks that have been made by Wayne and by Valerie on ecological production functions, if you allow me, because I think that's a central concept. At least it comes across as a central concept. Now, ecological production functions, in the words of you, Valerie, link service-producing units to ecosystem delivery, right? And your definition comes close to that, at least for me. You also said, Valerie, that service-providing units are rarely the test animals that we use today. And you said we need a standard protocol for model design that links test endpoints to ecosystem delivery. Yeah, I took notes because I think this is important, but it's also difficult to handle. Because if we don't know the service providing units, how are we going to model them? And actually, is service providing unit, is that a useful concept in the first place? Because is there such thing as a unit that provides ecosystem delivery? The relationship between species and functions and services, as you said yourself, is not straightforward, or at least it's, if we know about it, it's non-linear. So could you, and perhaps you also, Wayne, dwell upon this concept of ecological production functions?
Yep, we can hear you. Yep.
I'm on. Okay,
You're
great.
on.
Thank you for that. And let me first clarify. When I say a unit, I do not mean to imply something simplistic, a simple organism or group of organisms. A service-providing unit could be a group of species interacting in a food web, or a group of species interacting with its environment. I mean, my focus has mostly been on the biological side of things rather than on the abiotic side of things, and I guess that's because we worry that our chemicals are impacting the biology, not the physical habitat, and that's my, kind of bias. So I think, yes, we can define service-providing units. Sometimes they're sometimes individual organisms, but mostly they're populations or groups of interacting populations.
Okay, yes, and then I'll let Wayne come in and comment.
But aren't those service-providing units always context-specific?
What do you mean by context?
Well, in one landscape, the ecosystem delivery may be provided by other service-providing units than in another landscape.
Well, I think if we think about it from a more restricted agricultural practice perspective, there's not an infinite number of agricultural landscapes in let's say, just in Europe, and there are a finite number of, if not species, functional groups or groups of taxa that are in those landscapes. So I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I do think it's possible to get a better handle on these kinds of relationships. And I appreciate the complexity that you brought up in your talk. Yeah, there's a lot of detail there. But we ought to remember, even though it might be difficult and we might not get it perfect, is it better than what we're doing now?
Wayne, and then I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I'm going to try to be a bit provocative, which Valerie knows isn't my usual modus operandi. I'm going to turn this question around, or the process, the way of thinking about this around. rather than trying to take what we currently measure and extrapolate it up to ecosystem services, I would propose that we focus on what those protection goals should be in terms of ecosystem services, and then work backwards through the ecological production functions, find out what data are absolutely needed to make predictions or projections about stressor effects, be they singular, as in a single plant protection product, or in combination with other stressors, and then develop what's needed to do that extrapolation. So the issue of service unit, to me, is kind of irrelevant. Rather, I think we ought to start with a protection goal and work backwards to find out what we really need to get.
Thank you. Please, Marie.
Yeah, I would like to come back to what Valerie nicely put as the difference between what we measure and what we care about. I think if we're going to make progress also when it comes to environmental risk assessment, come to food, is to better address what we care about and how to capture that and how to kind of communicate to that. And too often we think it's just information need, but people sit out there and there are other things they also care about: school, elder care, child care, health, and so on. So I think it's crucially important to bring in perspectives that can take care of these holistic perspectives. And in doing so, maybe we also could recognize ecosystem services is one way of framing it. We might need other words. I think one problem with the catchy term ecosystem services, we thought that that is kind of one size fits all. But in communicating to people, in describing what we really care for and what is important for us, we might need other words. And I think, I mean, we are all decision makers, at least in ordinary democracies. It's not just the policymakers. Every time we come to the shop and we can see if, if the bees are declining, we know it will impact. I mean, the food is quite very central to our parts of life, so that comes close to us. I think what ecosystem services and this debate could be, it is how do we highlight also the regulating ones, which I think is something that we do not always understand, the relation between what we eat and what we live for and what we appreciate when we go out in green areas, and the regulating functions.
Okay, I want to come back to that in a little bit. Anne, from your point of view, what would you like to say?
So to just bounce back on what you've just said on the societal importance, and to perhaps to witness the discussions we had when we were talking to stakeholders during the field visits. So we were in these beautiful landscapes in Puglia, where you've got multiple cultures and superb olive trees, and you've got the tomato production and etc. And I mean, those of you who've been there, you can say it's really gorgeous. So we were there, and we were discussing with these producers, and I believe that in the societal exchanges, in the ways they grow their crops, you know, historically, but through families, they've been tomato producers for generations, and they really love their jobs to the heart, but they wouldn't compromise any of the services to be protected, to keep this. And this is why I just wanted to give a note of hope there, because when you talk locally and you involve the stakeholders in a common understanding of what you're trying to do, at no moment we heard, oh, but who cares of the pollinators, we want to keep our business going. That doesn't happen, and they are willing to dialogue and to help. And I think that having this dialogue, the scale at which you've got it is also important, because we can have dialogues at a quite high level, but also involving local is going to be important, and help better look at the services you want to protect, knowing that everybody is agreed that there will be no compromise on the risk side and the protection side. Just wanted to share that because it rejoins what you said. So, and in this respect, it was quite interesting to go talk with them and go observe with them what the service looks like. sadly we couldn't put all the inputs and the assemblages you were mentioning to describe them, but I think it's possible. And do that with them so that they are sensibilized to it and going to help you doing so.
What was very evident this morning was that, or is, that there are lots of information gaps. There are some conceptual ideas forming based in some data-rich areas, but others which are completely, almost devoid of data. What can we do to plug some of these gaps, or which are the most important gaps that you think should be plugged? And I know each of you could go on for an hour on that, but let's just try and crystallize. If you wanted to put in a hierarchy, what's your top 2 gaps that should be filled? Wayne?
Yeah, again, I don't have specific answers to that, but I would say it should be driven by what the ultimate protection goals are. And then we can figure out what we know and what we don't know. Mm-hmm. That would identify where the priority needs are with respect to empirical information, modeling, maybe new test evaluation protocols. It should all be driven, in my mind, and this comes back to the values issue, which is a very rich and complex subject, and I didn't mean to imply that environmental economics is the solution, but it is part of the solution, and it helps to identify what those top-end goals should be, and from that we can figure out what we need.
Thank you. Just if I could intercede and remind you that you have an app on your phones. I have bright light in my eyes, so I cannot see you playing with your phones, but if you have some questions, please bring them forward and they'll come up on the tablet and we can introduce those into the discussion as well. Valerie.
Okay, I'll start by saying what I think it's not, and that is more toxicity data for other species. And what I've seen over the years is we are completely obsessed with getting toxicity responses in our handful of organisms under simplified conditions, which probably because we evolved from human toxicology, but I think this relates a lot to what Wayne said, is if we were really serious about making our risk assessments better, we would start with what we wanted to protect and work back. And I feel in many of our conversations, we're kind of constrained by the data that we currently collect, that's determined by the guidance documents and what have you. And what I see from risk assessors is every time we try to make the risk assessments better, let's say by trying to incorporate ecosystem services or maybe by trying to incorporate more sophisticated modeling, there's serious pushback because what they see is you're making my life more difficult and complicated because we have to do everything that we're currently doing today plus this new stuff that you want us to do. And I think if we were to take Wayne's approach, we would maybe get rid of some of the stuff that we're doing today and have more streamlined risk assessments.
There's a great deal of nodding going on the stage. Please. Anne?
Yeah, so, on this question of how to connect and how we cover well, a learning from the field that was like when we talk about environmental compartment quality, like groundwater quality or air quality, this is something you can get from a dossier, from a risk assessment. You're quite close to this. So again, on the fate aspect of side, we're probably closer. So all the fate indicators and whatever we can use to do a risk assessment that links to ecosystem services, you just need to go there and look at how you can adapt to a situation. So it's not me having convulsions. I've got a pet fly since the beginning of the morning. But it's more on the, as Valérie said, on the species side that we're not there yet. And on this, well, we can indeed look at our testing. I was also wondering about the directions or the information that we could get from metabolomic and all those, how we can use this to better extrapolate or create groups or identify if there are grouping that could be done in terms of sensitivity, or look at the metabolism enzyme packages to understand how large are the differences between groups. So there are probably additional information that we could look at that could complete the picture regarding this.
Okay, thank you. Live, please.
I just want to endorse what Valerie just said. I totally agree with that. And I think that some of the current endpoints from an ecological perspective are close to meaningless.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to think how far reach out is a risk assessment, what you include in that term. I mean, is it also risk management? And then I think maybe going from information to ownership. I mean, that's kind of repeating what I said before, but in other words, to make it clearer to the broad audience of us that all are impacting and increasing the risks or the problems, that we are part of the problem, and see how we can deal with it, and then communicate how our kind of lives put at risk our existence. So I think there is a gap in that, and that the gap includes then how we bridge between the very important knowledge that we need to have about these risks, and how we then dare to, though we don't have the all full understanding of it, communicate it in a way.
On the app. We have a new question. Okay, that's fine. And there's still the one.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Let me widen it slightly, and let's say, how would you prioritize research needs, taking recent developments in other disciplines? Because we can learn a lot from the approach. Some are ecologists, some are social scientists, some are geographers, some are defenders, if I can put it that way, of the environment. We can all learn from different disciplines. So can you broaden what you've just said? Can you think of examples that we can learn and bring in from other disciplines? Wayne, you were taking a rather holistic approach.
Would you ask that question a little bit differently? I'm not sure I fully understood.
Sorry, say again.
Could you ask that question a little differently? I'm not quite sure I fully understood.
There are developments in other disciplines outside our own core disciplines which we could bring in and learn lessons from. I'm asking you, from your knowledge and your involvement and your insight into what's going on around and the context, can you think of examples that we could bring in usefully into this particular area?
Yeah, well, certainly the social sciences, writ large, not just economics, but psychology, geology, or geography, I should say, decision sciences, forming multidisciplinary teams of people to create the constructs that ultimately will support risk management decisions, I think is key, especially if we're talking about bringing in concepts such as ecosystem services, which are so value-driven from the get-go. Without ecosystem services, we'd still be talking about conventional endpoints, in which case biology and ecology is probably sufficient, perhaps with the addition of decision sciences to help develop those decision support systems that are needed. Of course, that pushes against the policy and regulatory constructs and frameworks that are already in place. In terms of specific issues, I'm not quite sure I could come up with any off the top of my head. I know where I'm from, we're working very closely with a collection of social scientists to address questions that are akin to risk assessment, but not exactly risk assessment. They're still environmental decision making, providing the science support, I should clarify, for environmental decision making. And that's very successful, and it gets at understandings and expertise that any one of those groups individually would not be able to access because of the multidisciplinary nature.
Okay.
Going in a linear process. I would say, I mean, certainly we have tools in many of our scientific, and I mean scientific broadly defined, social sciences, natural sciences, etc., that we could make better, right? But for me, the tools are pretty much there. I mean, it's more a matter of getting agreement on which ones to implement and how. So there are lots of different tools for valuation, whether they're socioeconomic or whether there are other ways to value, as Marie brought up. But really, it's about having a discussion to say, okay, which do we want to use in this context? So it's not the science, if you will, but it's the multi-stakeholder discussion and agreement, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just one word.
Yes, go on.
Case studies would help then, because we can put them to the test. We've seen this morning, so we tried. I'm not saying we failed or we succeeded, but we learned for sure. And as we were saying, we would probably fine-tune it better today from what we've learned. So I do believe in the power of trying it real life and see what's missing from there.
Okay.
Yeah,
Please.
I agree very much what has been said, and I think it touches on the science role in society to kind of how we kind of strengthen that our science as a societal actor in times where facts are not facts all the time. So I mean, it's how we reflect on how we really take on and connect to societal issues. And I think what your question to me is also how do we work better interdisciplinary to kind of also come up with maybe a more joint, or at least a coherent answer. To me it is, scenarios is one way, because that's one place where none of us have been, and so we would discuss the future, then you can come from various perspectives to it. I also think that we need in academia to be better to have meeting places between various ideas. We often sit in our communities and discuss what develops our own kind of research line, but maybe the academic institution should be better at creating meeting places where we can have a good academic discussion from various standpoints.
That particular point came up yesterday afternoon. You know, is there a platform? Are there platforms where people can come together from different disciplines, different perspectives, with a common goal as to where they'd actually like to get to? Can I pull up the questions on the tablet and put them up on the screen? Because I think they're relevant to what we're doing. And while we're doing that, I'd again like to pick up a point that came out in the poll yesterday, which is the policy context of risk assessments. And that, to some extent, reins it back towards EFSA, because EFSA, as you know, is a risk assessment organisation, is not the risk manager. And that's actually an interesting distinction, but it's absolutely necessary to have a dialogue with the risk managers in terms of where your risk assessment should go and whether actually the information that you're going to produce is of any value at all to the individual who's making that decision. And I'd pass an observation with a wry smile that we spent the last 40 years trying to get the question right in order to try to help the information produced at a risk assessment that is actually valuable to the risk manager and ultimately the decision maker. Now, what can we do to increase that dialogue? And there is a question. Yes, it's that one, that one there. So there's a feeling out there that we need to get this dialogue. Originally, if you go back to in the food context, the food law and the installation of EFSA, it came out of the disaster of BSE and a number of other toxicological and environmental disasters that needed to separate the assessment from the management situation. Pendulum swung. Pendulum is still swinging. We need to ensure that there's enough interaction between the two to progress the risk assessment in a direction.
Well, I think you just provided an answer. That question was asked this morning of me as well, and I indicated that both in the EU and in the US, there had been a similar schism between risk assessment and risk management, I think for different reasons. But it's very clear that the risk assessment process can't provide the information needed to inform selection amongst decision alternatives if they don't know what the goals of the management decision are. It doesn't necessarily mean they need to know what the alternative decision options are, but they need to know what kind, the risk assessors need to know and understand what kind of information to provide. In order to get there, there has to be that meaningful dialogue, conversation between assessors and managers. Whether the assessment process and the management process stays separate or not is kind of irrelevant to having that communication take place.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of good reasons to keep the practice of risk assessment and risk management separate in the sense that risk assessment can tell you what the risk is or is likely to be, and the risk management says, okay, what should we do about it? But I absolutely agree that there needs to be much tighter conversation so that we know what the policy goals are in a way that is operational. And this was what started the EFSA opinion on ecosystem services back in 2000 whatever. You know, that no unacceptable effect on the environment sounds good, but how on earth do you put that into practice? And it's there, I think, where we need more clarity.
Yeah.
Yep. Fully agree. I think a dialogue is possible, even close dialogues. We've seen that in the case of ecosystem services. We always say we need common understanding and multiple stakeholders. So I do believe it's possible and it's necessary to agree on the common output. And it's possible, as we try to illustrate this morning, from the moment that you do not question the risk assessment. It's not that we want to offset everything. So the conclusion of a risk assessment are not negotiable. It needs management. How do you do that? How do you check it worked? And get back to the risk assessors on what it works. So from the moment the objective is clear that we're not questioning the risk assessment in the debate, it shouldn't be a problem.
Okay, yeah. Oh. The question on the screen from Peter Doman, and I'll read, you can see it at the front, okay. Still addressing risk of chemicals, do we need to consider the alternatives and the impacts of the alternatives as well as in decision making and management? Now I think that's actually is true certainly in the area of GM, for example, where a comparator is obviously made of the crop and what is the difference between the crop that is modified in some form as compared to the unmodified crop. That's not so apparent in the chemical area. What do you think? Please, Lieve.
Well, I think the answer to that question is a wholehearted yes. But there's more to the question than just also considering nanoparticles or GMOs or whatever contaminants of the environment. If we take ecosystem services as an entry point for environmental risk assessment, we have to realize that ecosystem services are affected in a negative or a positive way by a range of drivers, not just the drivers that we are considering in current environmental risk assessment. So that will at least need to be considered because I see it as a complication. To what extent are changing ecosystem services actually due to the drivers that we consider now, and how are we going to incorporate the other drivers in our environmental risk assessment?
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, so Peter, you say that it still just addresses the risks of chemicals, and that's true as we've been talking about it this morning, and as we've been thinking about it, certainly as the EFSA opinion on ecosystem services was concerned. But it doesn't have to be. There's nothing about the ecosystem services concept as such. In fact, if we were to do it properly and start with the services, we would be doing a much more holistic risk assessment that would include a lot more than just the chemical effects on agricultural landscapes, right? It would include a lot of different things. That would be a complete paradigm shift if we were to do that.
I think there's a question that's come up which is related to that, and that's Les Furbank. A typical ERA approach goes from the lab to the ecosystem. Is it possible that we could go the other way around? And that's, I think, what you were
I think that was the point I was trying to make, is let's start with the end goal first and work inwards from there to determine what we need. I do want to just add a note that relative to Peter's question earlier, that ecological production function I showed in cartoon version during my talk had multiple stressors in it, only one of which was plant protection products. Now, there were other chemicals. There was lead and fishing gear and that sort of stuff. But the whole point of looking at high-end endpoints is that you can dig into the multitude of factors that influence risks to that high-end endpoint.
We've got just a little under quarter of an hour to go, and I'd like to bring this back to where this conference has started from. And it started as a science conference organized by EFSA to bring in experts and views from different disciplines into this whole area. And ultimately, it's looking to find ideas which will go on into EFSA's strategic plan for the next period, which is 2020 to 27. Now, that resonates with what was said yesterday. And I think my question is, from EFSA's perspective, what could EFSA do now in this area? And the history is there because Valerie went through the history very clearly. The PPR published its opinion in 2010. I was chairing, Valerie was part of that. We published it again in another context in 2012. In 2016, the Scientific Committee of EFSA produced a large guidance to develop specific protection goal options for environmental risk assessment in relation to biodiversity and ecosystem services. In 2017, there was a joint symposium in Oslo between the Norwegian Scientific Committee on Food and Environment, VKM, and EFSA on exactly this, protection goals, and where was the work going, what was the attempts to get to a position where one could model on a wider scale and work through. So to peg it back, following that, what could EFSA usefully do in the near future to progress this? Because at the moment, I have a lot of sympathy with what Valerie said. We're at the descriptive stage, and there is a need to go up a level if we're going to move where we think we probably ought to be moving. Is that fair reflection? What should we do? What should EFSA do? Valerie?
EFSA's listening. I mean, in a perfect world, I would love it if we could, all these great ideas that we've been discussing and completely turn things on their head and really start with what we want to protect and work our way back, as Wayne suggested. More realistically, I suspect that we're probably going to remain constrained. I mean, this is like a tanker ship that we're trying to turn, right? So it's not going to move very quickly, but I think a very realistic and practical next step would be, if one recognizes that we probably do need some more mechanistic, quantitative modeling to back up the descriptive conceptual framework provided by ecosystem services, that to me would be an obvious next step to try to, in a multi-stakeholder kind of consortium or collaboration, try to agree on a set of say, services and the models that could support those, at least the conceptual models, and that could be then implemented with formal modeling underneath. It wouldn't do everything, but it would be a step forward,
Okay.
I think.
That's helpful. Thank you.
I'm not sure I'm responding exactly the way you want, but I was just wondering if this paradigm shift that Valerie talks about, if this is currently in line with the shift that at least I perceive to some extent in the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union, then EFSA might actively support that shift in the Common Agricultural Policy towards more varied provision of ecosystem services in agricultural landscapes. And then informing that process by actually suggesting ways to base environmental risk assessment on more than just the effects of chemicals.
Anne, any ideas?
What should EFSA do? You ask me. No, I pretty much agreed with what Valérie was suggesting. In an ideal world, we probably need to go out, look at those ecosystem services and walk our way back to make sure we are identifying the right input in what makes a service happen. We've got the right assemblages, the right processes, and as we see, we do the right reasoning about that, and develop the right tools. Really, I'm not saying that what we are doing is wrong, but as Valérie said, we work with proxies. Some are probably the right ones. Some need more thinking. Some need more of a step to interpret on a case by case on the crop, for example, for the pesticide on the crop point of view. So there is this gap, and this gap needs a reality check. So I would pretty much defend that.
Okay.
To have a project around that, really.
Right.
Also.
Thank you.
Case studies.
Yeah. Marie, do you want to add anything?
Well, very honestly, I'm not so familiar with what EFSA is doing, so I shouldn't say what you should be doing. But what I see happening in my own country, Sweden, but I hear is an issue in EU also is the sectorization when we work with sustainability goals. So if there's something, maybe I would encourage it also to link to other kind of this. Agencies that work with sustainability challenges. So it's not EFSA is working on one way of making a more sustainable world, and then it's not kind of communicated with other initiatives within EU. So though EFSA is great if it does a good job, but also I hope that EU, if it's not there, works for having intersectorial communications as well, because we need to address all the sustainability challenges at the same time. We cannot, and we need to find an integrated way of how we do this in the best way, and that is certainly not an easy task. No. But to overcome the sectorization in when we're addressing the various challenges we are facing, that would be my suggestion.
Step 1. Organize participatory stakeholder meetings to identify key protection goals that are couched in terms of ecosystem services. Step 2, enlist the natural and social scientists to develop the ecological production functions either in conceptualized format or linked empirically and mechanistically. Step 3, compare what's needed to understand the kinds of decisions that EFSA is intending to inform on those ecological production functions, and compare that to the current data you currently collect. And step 5, identify new streams of data where you're not collecting the right data.
Okay, well that was pretty clear. Thank you.
That's a 30-year plan.
Okay, what I was going to add was that EFSA, of course, is doing something in separate areas. And one of the examples is what they've been doing with bees. which has been looking to consider how bees are responding to multi-stressors, but through that developing models which enable you to identify and predict honeybee populations. That's combined with field monitoring, which provides this link across, as you identified earlier on. And that, at the same time, is progressing the modeling scenario, which is useful in other situations. So it's a good example to throw in there. I think we've done pretty well. We've got through, I think, a reasonable number of questions and different ideas. I thank you for adding questions on the app. I'm sorry, with floodlights in my eyes, I can't see the audience. You may have gone to lunch, but I can't see you if you put your hand up to ask a question. I apologize. I'm very grateful to our 5 speakers, and on your behalf, I'd like to thank them and hope that you thank them in the usual way, please. Thank you very much.